All right, diving in today, folks, we're taking on a fascinating, kind of a head scratcher of a topic. Skeptical theism. Is that ringing any bells for you?
Oh, it certainly is. And it's a deep one.
Yeah.
We're really getting into like the core of this age-old question, the one that probably everyone's pondered at some point. If there's a God, and this God is all powerful, all knowing, all good, the whole shebang, then why is there so much suffering and evil in the world?
Yeah, it's a classic, isn't it? That tension between like a perfect God and a world that's, well, obviously not so perfect. And, for this deep dive, you've steered us toward the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, their entry on skeptical theism. It's a pretty impressive resource, gotta say.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you won't find a more thorough and well-respected source in the field. And, for our listener out there, our fellow philosopher, this gives us the nitty-gritty, the framework, the really solid grounding we need to unpack a topic as intricate as this. Because, we're not just skimming the surface here. We're going deep. Mm-hmm. Our aim is to really dissect those core arguments, grapple with the big philosophical discussions, and walk away with a rock-solid understanding of what this skeptical theism really is all about.
Right on. It's about more than just God's existence, right? It's more like, well, it seems to address this clash between a perfect God, like we said, omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent, the whole nine yards, and then the undeniable reality of, pain, suffering, evil. It's like, how can both be true?
Yeah.
And so we get this whole, the problem of evil, right? And all of those arguments that stem from that are, what do we call them? Arguments from evil.
Exactly. And right there, you've hit on the essence of the problem. Skeptical theism steps in and offers a particular response within this whole debate and saying, hold on a minute, even if we grant that there is a God, a theistic God, we still have to acknowledge that our human capacity to understand God's grand plan, especially when it comes to the extent and nature of evil, that's got to be limited. We just can't wrap our heads around it.
So it's not so much about denying God, it's about acknowledging the limits of, us, our own understanding. And then, if I'm getting this right, that very skepticism is what aims to kind of soften the blow of those arguments from evil. Like, hey, we might not get it, so how can we use that lack of understanding as an argument against God?
That's a really sharp way to put it. And it's so important to remember, as our source emphasizes, skeptical theism doesn't hinge on the truth of theism itself. It's a position that you can hold, whether you're a theist, an atheist, an agnostic, whatever. The core idea still stands. But, it's true that theists often use it as a sort of shield, a defense against this problem of evil. Mm-hmm. It's like saying, look, even if God exists, we're just not equipped to judge his actions.
So it's not some brand new out there idea. The entry talks about its historical roots, mentions figures like Stephen Wickstra, William Alston, Alvin Plantinga, a bunch of others. Seems like a whole lot of pretty deep and at times pretty technical philosophical work has gone into this.
Oh, tons of it. And, it's been building up since Wickra's really groundbreaking paper back in '84. So now that we've got the lay of the land, let's really dig into the meat of it. Let's see what the main arguments are and how this skeptical theism actually engages with them.
Sounds good. And I see here the entry starts off by looking at this outweighing goods argument. Could you maybe break down the basics of that one for us?
Absolutely. So it starts with this idea. If God exists and he permits evil, there's got to be a good reason.
Right.
There has to be some greater good achieved, or maybe a worse evil prevented by letting that evil happen. They call these outweighing goods. And then there's this version of the argument, the not outweighed version, which basically says, look, there's at least one evil out there that just doesn't seem necessary for any outweighing good. And from that, they conclude, well, God can't exist then, right?
So they're saying we got to find an example of evil that's just like completely pointless. No greater good comes out of it. And the entry mentions this whole no-seum inferences thing coined by Wickstra. Right. What's the deal with that?
Oh, the no-seum inference. It's like those tiny little no-seum bugs, right? You can't see them, but they're definitely there, biting so. So the argument goes, if we no-see an outweighing good for some particular evil, well, we can just go ahead and assume that no such good exists. And they use some pretty powerful examples here, like think about a fawn, a baby deer dying in a forest fire. Mm-hmm. Horrible, right? Or a child suffering abuse, being murdered. Mm-hmm. You look at those situations and try to imagine what possible good could justify that. And if we can't come up with a good enough answer, a good enough theodicy, an explanation for God's reasons, then we say, well, there must not be one. The idea is that if there were a morally good enough reason, surely we'd be smart enough to see it, right?
Yeah, it's like saying, look, God gave us brains, so if there's a good reason, he'd make sure we could at least get a hint of it. But then this is where skeptical theism comes in and says, whoa, hold on, not so fast. They challenge that whole assumption. And I see here they bring in cornea-based criticisms. Sounds like a mouthful, but it seems key to their response.
It absolutely is. Cornea, it's an acronym, stands for Condition on Reasonable Epistemic Access. Bit of a tongue twister, I know. And, the entry jokes about how unprincipled that acronym is, but hey,
Yeah.
it gets the point across. So the Cornea principle, basically, it sets out the conditions under which it makes sense to base a belief on some evidence. A simplified version, SC, says that you can believe something, let's call it P, based on evidence, Q, only if you also have reason to believe that if P wasn't true, then Q would likely be different, taking into account your cognitive abilities.
So just to make sure I'm with you here, if I don't see something, I can only believe it's not there if I also have good reason to think I would see it if it were there, right?
You got it. And skeptical theists take that logic and apply it directly to the no-seeum argument. They're saying believing that there's no outweighing good just because we don't see one, well, that only makes sense if we could also reasonably believe that if such a good did exist, we would be able to perceive it.
And that's where those analogies come in.
Right.
The parent-child one and the physical depth versus moral depth analogy.
Exactly. The parent-child analogy highlights that huge gap in understanding between, a tiny baby and a parent who's making decisions, planning for that child's future. And the skeptical theist says, look, our cognitive abilities compared to God's, it's like that. We're the baby. God's the parent. Just like a baby can't grasp the complex reasoning behind its parents' choices, we might just not be able to understand God's far-reaching plan. It's not just that God's smarter, it's that the way he thinks, the way he understands things, it might be so fundamentally different from ours that our little human categories just don't apply.
And the depth analogy, what's that about?
So, with that one, they draw a parallel between, the universe, what we see, and a potential moral universe, which is governed by God's purposes. Like, we know the physical universe is full of hidden complexities, things that are hard to detect, hard to understand. So God's plans, they could be like that too. They might have this moral depth to them, containing goods that are obscured, hidden from our immediate grasp. It's not always about surface-level stuff we can easily identify.
So even if these good reasons exist, we might not be equipped to see them. And just because we can't find them, it doesn't mean they aren't there. So that no-seeum inference, that whole not seeing it means it doesn't exist, well, it kind of falls apart.
Exactly. You've nailed it.
Yeah.
And from there, the entry moves on to another way they try to defend this not outweighed premise, using inductive inferences. So it's not just about what seems to be the case. They're trying to go a bit deeper, use logic.
I got the pepper garden analogy. That one was pretty neat.
Oh, it's a good one. It shows how we might see a pattern in a limited sample. Like, imagine you've only ever seen certain types of hot peppers, and you notice that none of them flower in early spring. So you might think, okay, maybe no hot peppers flower in early spring. Right. If your sample's representative, that inductive leap might make sense.
And how does that connect to the problem of evil? Where are they going with this?
So they draw a parallel. We know of some outweighing goods, right? Things that could justify God letting certain evils happen. But then we look at those really horrific evils, like the fawn or the abused child, and none of those goods seem good enough to justify that.
What?
So the argument goes, if none of the good reasons we know of would cut it, then maybe no good reasons would. And that brings us back to the not outweighed premise, that some evils just aren't outweighed by any good.
But then skeptical theism swoops in again, challenging that whole inductive reasoning. And this time it's about, well, whether our sample of known goods is really a good representation of all possible God-justifying goods.
You got it. They're asking, are the outweighing goods we humans are familiar with, are those really representative of this vast, maybe even incomprehensible realm of goods that could factor into God's plan? They say no, probably not. Our sample isn't random, it's limited by what we experience as humans, by how we think. We haven't exactly mapped out all the possible goods, right?
Yeah. And this is where we get Bergman's 3 skeptical theistic theses, ST1, ST2, ST3. They all kind of get at this idea of how limited we are in understanding this whole thing.
Right. ST1 says we don't have a good reason to think that the good things we can know are representative of all good things. ST2 makes a similar claim about the evils we understand, are those representative of all possible evils. And then ST3 extends it to the connections between goods and the permission of evils. Like, Just because we can't fathom a connection doesn't mean one doesn't exist.
So it's not saying we know our understanding is wrong. It's saying, hey, we don't have a solid reason to think it's right.
Exactly. And the entry also touches on the idea that, even the outweighing goods we do know, maybe those could justify God's permission of suffering. But the connection, how they fit together, that might just be too complex for us to grasp. It's like, imagine a chess grandmaster making a move that seems bizarre to a beginner. The beginner just doesn't see the strategy, the bigger picture.
All right, so we've seen how skeptical theism tackles these outweighing goods arguments, but then the entry moves on to what they call no-seum arguments directly. What's the difference here?
So the focus shifts a bit. Before, it was about whether we can see the good reasons. Now it's about using those no-seum evils, where God's permission doesn't seem necessary for any good, as direct evidence against God's existence. Like they're saying the evil itself is a reason to doubt God, because there just doesn't seem to be need for it. So before it was, we don't see a good enough reason for God to allow evil. Now it's the evil itself shows God doesn't exist because there's no need for it.
Okay, so there's a shift there. And then they break down this category into individual case argument, and they bring in confirmation theory. Sounds pretty formal.
It is. Confirmation theory, it's all about how evidence affects our belief in a hypothesis. The basic idea is a piece of evidence, E, counts against the hypothesis, H, if the probability of H being true, given E, is lower than the probability of H on its own. Often it involves comparing how likely we'd see E if H was true versus how likely we'd see E if H was false. It's like if you see a wet umbrella inside, does that make it more or less likely it rained outside? That's confirmation theory in a nutshell.
Okay, I kind of get that. But how does that apply to, they use no known goods, NKG here. How does that fit in?
So Rowe argued that the probability of seeing NKG, like no outweighing good that we know of that could justify, the fawn's suffering or the child's, it's really high, maybe even 100% of atheism is true. Because if there's no God, there are no divine permissions to be justified. So no need for any justifying goods.
Yeah.
Right. So seeing NKG, it makes sense under atheism. But then they say the probability of seeing NKG, if theism is true, is low. Because a good God wouldn't let us suffer without any reason, without any explanation.
So they're saying God would give us a reason, right?
Yeah, that's the assumption.
Yeah.
But skeptical theists, they object to that. They say, hold on, remember ST1 and ST2? We're limited. We don't fully understand the good and the evil out there, so we can't just say God wouldn't have a reason, even if we don't see it.
Right, that whole limited understanding thing. And then there's the cumulative case argument, where they look at the sheer number of evils that seem unjustified.
Yeah, this argument says even if each individual evil just slightly weakens the case for theism, when you add them all up, all those evils, it becomes a strong argument against God, like death by 1,000 cuts for theistic belief.
And the skeptical theist response here, it uses that analogy about the sun rising and setting and how that might disprove a certain version of heliocentrism, right?
Exactly. The point is that some evidence might disprove a specific version of a theory, one that makes a prediction that doesn't match what we observe. But that same evidence won't necessarily disprove other versions of that theory. So those seemingly unjustified evils, yeah, they might disprove a version of theism where God always explains his reasons for suffering, but they don't disprove versions where, well, sometimes God's reasons are just beyond us.
So it's a really subtle point about how to weigh evidence against a big, complex idea. And then the entry moves on to comparing skeptical theism to other ways of responding to the problem of evil, like theodicies and defenses.
Right. It's really important to get this distinction. Skeptical theism isn't about giving explanations for God's actions, like a theodicy does. And it's not about giving possible reasons that could justify God, like a defense does. It's simply saying, we can't know. It's not offering any reasons, actual or possible. In fact, skeptical theists will often say straight up, I don't know what the connection is between those potential goods and the evils we see. I just don't know.
So it seems like there's a bit of a tension there. On the one hand, they're saying we can't know God's reasons, but on the other hand, defenses are trying to give possible reasons, and theodicies are trying to give actual reasons. Doesn't that clash a bit?
It does seem like there's a tension, yeah. But the entry suggests that, logically speaking, it might make sense to use different kinds of responses for different arguments about evil. Like for a specific argument about a particular kind of evil, yeah, you can't say we know the reason and we can't know the reason at the same time. That'd be contradictory. But when you're talking about all sorts of different arguments, all different aspects of evil, maybe a combined approach works. It's a tricky philosophical question, how to make those different responses fit together.
And they also point out that a lot of skeptical theists, they kind of assume that God does have obligations to us, like he owes us some good, even though that's not, strictly speaking, part of the skeptical theist position.
That's true. The basic idea of skeptical theism doesn't require you to believe that God has to have justifying reasons for allowing evil. But the way skeptical theists argue, it often implies that. They're focused on saying, we can't know the reasons, not there are no reasons, or no reasons are needed. The entry compares this to, like, really extreme responses that say God has no obligations to us whatsoever, but those don't really fit with the way most skeptical theists argue.
Okay, so we've covered the main arguments and how skeptical theists respond, but then the entry gets into all these objections to skeptical theism itself. And it starts with epistemological concerns. The first one is this worry about an infinite regress from using cornea principles.
Right. So some critics say if you keep applying cornea principles, you get stuck in this endless chain of needing more and more justification. Like if I believe P because of Q, and that requires me to also believe if P was false, Q would probably be different. And then that belief needs further justification according to cornea and so on. Well, you never reach solid ground, do you?
And then there's the problem that cornea seems to clash with some of our just basic, everyday inductive beliefs. They use that daycare example to illustrate it.
Oh, yeah, the daycare example. So it seems reasonable to believe that, your kid will nap at daycare today based on all the times they've napped there before, right? But if they didn't nap, the evidence you based your belief on, it'd still be the same.
Mm-hmm.
So if you apply a simple cornea principle, it seems like that reasonable belief is actually unjustified. And that just feels wrong, right?
The entry mentions that people who support cornea have tried to refine it, to address these issues, like limiting it to certain kinds of evidence or interpreting it in a probabilistic way.
Yeah, those refinements try to keep the core idea of cornea, but avoid those problems. Like by saying cornea only applies to really strong evidence, you might avoid the infinite regress. And a probabilistic interpretation, it tries to be more nuanced about that. If P was different, Q would probably be different condition. But whether these tweaks really solve the problems, that's still up for debate.
Another big epistemological objection they bring up is about what they call common sense epistemology and principles like the principle of credulity and phenomenal conservatism.
Right. Those principles basically say if something seems true to you, you have a basic, prima facie justification for believing it. And the objection is that skeptical theism, with all its talk about how limited we are, might conflict with that common sense. Like, if it really seems to us that some evil is totally unjustified, well, common sense might say, yeah, you're justified in believing that.
So how do skeptical theists respond to that?
Some say their critiques actually fit with those common sense principles. Like, sure, you might have an initial justification for a belief, but that can be overridden if there's other relevant stuff to consider. And the limits of our understanding, well, that's one of those things. Others just say, no, those common sense epistemology principles are just wrong. Maybe they could lead you to believe things that aren't really true, beliefs based on unreliable thinking.
Then there's the objection about external world skepticism and the possibility of, God deceiving us.
That's a big one, yeah. If we buy into the idea that we can't possibly understand God's reasons, well, how do we know he's not messing with us? How do we know he's not making the world seem one way when it's actually totally different?
Yeah.
The example he uses, what if God made the earth seem really old when it's actually not? A regular theist might say, well, I don't see why God would do that. But a skeptical theist can't really say that, right? Because their whole point is, we don't know what reasons God might have.
Right, because we could be missing something. So that opens up all sorts of possibilities for God tricking us about, pretty much anything.
Exactly. Skeptical theists have tried to answer this in a few ways. Some say, well, even if we don't consciously know all the reasons, we can still have knowledge. It's called externalism about knowledge. Others say maybe we can just trust our senses, at least initially, without having to completely rule out deception. But it's a tough one, for sure.
And then there's a similar objection, religious skepticism, focusing on things we only believe because God supposedly revealed them, like the afterlife, and also our ability to know what God wants us to do.
Right. That objection says if we can't be sure God's not deceiving us, well, then how can we be sure about anything he supposedly told us? And when it comes to knowing God's commands, well, trying to figure out what God would command, it kind of sounds like those no-theism arguments that skeptical theists criticize, right? If we can't trust our judgment about whether God has a good reason for letting evil happen, why should we trust our judgment about what God would command us to do?
So skeptical theism, it tries to defend theism from one set of problems, but then it might create new ones, especially in, epistemology and the whole justification of religious belief. And then the entry gets into moral objections to skeptical theism. The first one is the moral deliberation objection.
This one worries about the implications for action. Like, if you're a skeptical theist and you see some terrible evil happening, should you intervene? Or should you think, well, maybe God has a reason I don't understand, so I shouldn't interfere? That seems pretty messed up, morally speaking. And it can also create real dilemmas if you believe God wants us to prevent evil.
So you might be tempted to just stand back and do nothing, thinking, maybe this suffering is part of God's plan, I shouldn't mess with it.
Yeah, it's a worrying implication. Skeptical theists have a few responses to this. Some say God has commanded us to fight evil, so that's what we should do, regardless of whether we understand God's bigger picture. Others say, well, there's a difference between God allowing evil because the evil itself is needed for some good, and God allowing evil because it's a side effect of some good. Like maybe the possibility of evil is necessary for free will or for developing moral character. In that case, just because God allows the possibility of evil doesn't mean we shouldn't try to stop it when we see it happening.
The next moral objection is all things considered value skepticism. What's that one about?
So this one says, if we can't possibly understand all of God's plans and all the long-term consequences of everything, then can we really judge the overall value of anything? Like, we might see something as good or bad, but we can't know its ultimate value in God's big scheme of things.
And if we can't judge overall value, that makes it hard to know what's right or wrong.
Right? Yeah, if you can't say what's ultimately good or bad, how do you know what to do? Some skeptical theists admit that their view might make it hard to make those big, all things considered value judgments. But they also say, look, this problem of not knowing the ultimate consequences, it exists anyway, even without skeptical theism. We just never know everything.
The last moral objection they talk about is all things considered obligations skepticism, which seems to build on that value skepticism.
Right. If we can't judge what's ultimately good or bad, then how can we know what we're ultimately obligated to do? Especially if you believe in a moral theory like maximizing act consequentialism, where you're supposed to do whatever brings about the most good overall. Well, if you don't know what's ultimately good, how can you know what to do? And they say this problem applies to other moral frameworks too.
So what do skeptical theists say about this obligation problem?
Some try to separate the considerations that apply to God, running the universe, from the considerations that apply to us humans, making our little moral choices. Like maybe we can know enough about good and evil to guide our actions, even if we can't understand God's big plan. Howard Snyder has this dilemma argument where he says this moral skepticism, it comes more from those demanding moral theories than from skeptical theism itself. Like if your moral theory requires you to know all the ultimate consequences, well, you're going to be stuck anyway, even if you don't believe in skeptical theism.
Okay, so skeptical theism, it's meant to solve one problem, but it seems like it raises a whole bunch of new ones. And then the entry shifts gears a bit and talks about the scope of skeptical theism, saying that it's really aimed at those no-seum inferences.
That's the main target, for sure. It's about challenging arguments that say, just because we don't see a reason, it means there isn't one.
And they also look at whether other types of arguments from evil, maybe they're immune to skeptical theism, like non-inferential arguments.
Yeah, non-inferential arguments, they're based on this idea that we have this direct intuitive grasp of certain evils being unjustified. And arguments based on, say, phenomenal conservatism might say we're justified in believing that just because it seems so obvious. But like we talked about before, skeptical theists might say, well, our intuitions can be wrong, especially when it comes to stuff like this. Or maybe those skeptical theistic considerations, they provide reasons to override those initial intuitions.
What about those Humean arguments? The ones that compare theism to other explanations for the world, based on how good and evil are distributed.
Skeptical theists often say, look, we can't really make those big comparisons, not accurately anyway. Our understanding is just too limited. And they might suggest possibilities within a theistic framework that could account for the good and evil we see. Like Peter Van Inwagen's idea of a necessary distribution, where the way good and evil are spread out, maybe that's just a necessary part of achieving some greater good that we can't understand.
And lastly, what about those arguments from divine hiddenness? The ones that say God can't exist because he seems hidden from people who are open to believing.
Skeptical theists, they'd say, just because we don't see a good reason for God's hiddenness doesn't mean there isn't one. They go back to that limited understanding argument.
So Skeptical theism is mostly about taking down those no-seeum arguments, but it has implications for other arguments too. And then the entry wraps up by talking about theory development and how that relates to skeptical theism. There's this worry that just adding skeptical theistic claims to theism is a bit of a, ad hoc move. Like they're just patching up the theory.
That's a crucial point in philosophy. If you're just adding things to a theory to make it fit the evidence without any real justification, it seems kind of weak, right? It's like those epicycles they kept adding to the geocentric model to explain why planets sometimes seem to move backwards. That was just patching things up.
So they're worried that skeptical theism is doing the same thing, just saying, well, God's reasons are beyond us whenever someone brings up the problem of evil.
Yeah, that's the worry. But the entry points out that people who defend skeptical theism, they try to address that. They try to show that their claims about human limitations, they make sense on their own, or at least they make sense if theism is true. They use analogies, like comparing us to beginners in some field, to show why it's reasonable to think we can't understand God.
Yeah.
That debate between William Rowe and Stephen Wickstra about what we should expect if theism is true, that gets right to the heart of this issue.
And the entry mentions two more things that are important for developing skeptical theism as a theory. First, they need to do more than just respond to the problem of evil. They need to build a bigger picture of what theism looks like. And second, for people who follow a specific religion, they need to explain how that fits with skeptical theism.
Those are big challenges for the theory. It can't just be a defense mechanism against the problem of evil. It needs to be integrated into a fuller, more positive understanding of theism. And for people who are religious, they have to figure out how their specific beliefs and practices can be justified, even though they're skeptical about understanding God's actions.
Well, this has been a deep dive, for sure. So for our listener out there, our fellow philosopher, skeptical theism, it's a big deal in philosophy of religion. It challenges those arguments from evil by saying, look, we're just not equipped to judge God's reasons. It uses arguments about our cognitive limitations and questions those noaceum inferences. But it faces its own set of problems, too, especially in epistemology and ethics. And it raises questions about how we build philosophical theories and how we justify religious beliefs.
Exactly. It's a starting point for a lot of deeper exploration. All those questions about Cornea principles, about moral theory, about philosophical theology, they all stem from this. Reading the works of those key figures we mentioned and really digging into the objections and responses, that's where the real insights are.
And on that note, here's a final thought to ponder, something for you, our philosophical listener, to chew on. Does accepting skeptical theism, does it ultimately make us more humble? Does it give us a more realistic view of our relationship with God? Or does it, maybe without meaning to, undermine our ability to judge the world, to make moral and epistemic judgments? That's a question that's still very much alive in this debate, a question that maybe each of us needs to wrestle with on our own philosophical journeys. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.